Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Phil Pochoda, the director of the University of Michigan Press, one of the nation's oldest and most respected academic presses. This is an unusual program. We'll be celebrating the year of the University Press, an observation of the Association of American University Presses and the Association of Research Libraries. Welcome to Rip Rap, Phil.
Thank you, Jim.
You said, just before we went on, that this is going to be, in January, the 75th anniversary of the U of M Press.
Yeah. The press has been in business for 75 years, which makes it one of the oldest, but not near the oldest university press. The first university press in the United States was Hopkins. I believe that was 1886. Hopkins was the first research university in the U.S. and felt that they needed a university press to publish the research that commercial presses would find not profitable. So they set up a university press because they were intended to lose money, but in order to disseminate the productions of their faculty. And that's been, until now, pretty much the motivation for university presses. After Hopkins, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, California, Columbia, Chicago, each were started about the turn of the century, and then a number of other presses came along in Michigan in 1930.
Well, as we're looking at the university press these days, including the U of M Press, there are some serious challenges that all academic presses are facing.
The challenges are severe. It's throughout the whole publishing world, but the university press world has its own specific set of problems and challenges which are quite severe. Not least is the fact that libraries, which had been the primary customer for university presses and for the books that university presses put out, have dramatically reduced the amount of titles and books that they buy. So that, for example, a decade ago you could count on anywhere from 750 to 1,000 copies of every title you publish being ordered for libraries. That number is down below 200.
Oh my God.
And that takes the props out of many books that really survived on their library sales. If you couple that with the fact that almost half textbook sales are now used books, and those would have been those are sales which come directly out of the coffers of university presses, you see that two of the major sales channels, have been dramatically curtailed. So university presses are now having to scramble to find ways to replace those sales or to reduce costs or whatever.
The whole reason we started Rip Rap was because I personally think that academic literature is exciting and full of information that's of value not only to other scholars, but to serious readers in the wider community.
As do I, and I think that's a point often sort of underrepresented, that though university presses have traditionally published books by scholars for scholars, because that was their initial mandate, increasingly, partly because of the need to find audiences to replace the loss of the scholarly audience, but often, as in the case of University of Michigan Press on principle, university presses have concluded that they are in a position to fill the void in serious publishing, both nationally as well as in their region. So that as the New York presses, now with one exception, have fallen under the control of international media conglomerates and been forced to contend with far higher economic thresholds required for every book they publish, increasingly serious literature, serious public commentary, serious political analysis falls to the university presses by default. So that the loss of university presses, even one or two, I think would affect public dialogue now in a way that was never true before. And university presses have not yet taken enough credit for this public service publishing they're doing. So if you look at the Middle East publishing, when a crisis comes, people turn to the university presses as virtually the sole source of information. No one else systematically attends to areas whether or not they're currently the fad, just because of their important nature in international relations or in general global developments. And in area after area, crime, incarceration, public health, education, all the major policy issues It's the university presses, I believe, that are doing the only systematic and sustained publishing to inform public dialogue, which would be much impoverished without university presses.
And we've seen a lot of those important topics that you've mentioned, as well as looking at historical content about violence and all those contemporary topics that people really want to understand better. And I can't think of a better and more appropriate author than someone who's been studying a certain area all of his or her life. And that gives a real depth to it. And the people who started watching our program have been people in that they're kind of tired of the talking heads on television and talking about better sex, you know, how to improve your golf game, and it's very superficial, or diets, or that kind of thing. It's all very superficial. People really want someone who can offer an informed position. But also with this, you've implied that, and I think you're saying that the university presses are having changed their marketing strategies.
Many have, and we, I think, are in the forefront of that here at Michigan. That is, we think that there's a tremendous opportunity, as well as obligation, to publish for broader audiences, non-academic audiences, crossover audiences, if only because a major state university, particularly one that has been justly renowned for taking the lead in affirmative action, for taking the lead in the incorporation of diverse communities into their teaching and into their academic programs, should have an affiliated press that also reaches out to these other audiences. It's not to deny the importance and the centrality of publishing for scholars, but we at Michigan and other university presses as well, not all but many, have accepted the responsibility to publish for these non-academic audiences, partly because of the void in other media, in New York publishing, in magazines and television, partly because we think we can do it better than anyone else, more informed, more systematic. Not every book is so dependent on high revenues, so that we do a better job, we do a more systematic job, more consistent job. The problem with that mission is that no one has to buy your book or know about it, so it requires associated marketing. People have to be informed about the existence of these books and their merits and their availability, and that's not cheap, and it's very hard for a press with limited resources, as any university press has, publishing as many as 150 new products a year, to use a crude word for books, but in this marketing context, to obtain the resources to promote them effectively and efficiently. So we have to make do with limited marketing budgets, but in that service we have put together here in the 3 years since I've come a really powerful marketing group. We may have the best publicist in the university press world. We pride ourselves on catalogs that really, I don't know if you can see this, that really both feature and effectively illustrate books that are really intended for a broad crossover audience, political books and historical books, true crime books. But these will not sell themselves. People have to know about them and hear about them. They don't go to professional meetings, as scholars did. So this requires print ad, which is usually too expensive for us to afford, other imaginative devices for getting the word out. We send out, when we just started a fiction list, for example. And the first two winners of our Michigan Literary Prize, which we run in conjunction with the Masters of Fine Arts program here, have been both wonderful books, but have been extremely successful. The first book, Sheila O'Connor's book, we have something like 13,000 in print.
Really?
And Walter Wetherell's book, maybe the best book I've ever read on World War I, a short book, has received spectacular reviews, euphoric reviews, in the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Minneapolis Tribune, in Entertainment Weekly, in the paper in Hanover, New Hampshire. These things can't just happen, and they don't happen automatically. It's because you have a publicity operation that sends out copies, that stays in contact with the reviewers, that works extraordinarily hard, given very limited resources, to make these books known and available to broad communities nationwide. This isn't easy, and we're facing, you know, the huge publicity barrage from the bigger presses who have unlimited budgets. And that we've been as successful as we are really pleases us, and we're quite proud of that. But it's a struggle. It's a real problem to get our books noticed. We have a bunch of great books that anybody, I think, would profit from reading, but it's hard to make everybody aware of them.
Well, and underneath it, there's an important point that you're making, which is it's a quality product, if you want to call it
That's
a product.
right. That's right.
That takes a lot of work. It's a craft and an art.
Right.
Because it entails identifying who's going to do it, how they're going to do it, and seeing it through the process. So if this all matches the standards of the press and for academic publishing, that's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, and it requires cooperation and the talents of a broad array of people. To put out a book that's going to sell to a popular audience, first you have to have an author who has something important to say, can write it properly. He has to be persuaded, or she has to be persuaded, that a university press, particularly one that had never been known for its popular books, can both treat it and promote it in effective ways. The book has to be produced in a very in a very attractive manner. You can't, I mean, frankly, books that go in the libraries can be relatively unattractive. They're going to buy it. People who have to buy a book will read it, whatever its physical appearance. That isn't true on books that go out in the stores. It's competing with shelves and tables of extremely attractive, seductive books, and ours has to be as well. This is the Wetherell novel that I alluded to, and it has to be designed both inside and out in a very attractive, accessible way, and I think we have now totally reconfigured our design department and our promotion department to be able to handle these sorts of books. But it's an across-the-board effort.
Let's talk a little bit about how an idea becomes a book. And you live in the world, and I understand it, but I'm not sure that people know what's entailed with it.
There's no short answer. Sometimes books come fully formed. I mean, it's an editor's dream, and it rarely happens. You walk into your office one day, a manuscript arrives in the mail, and it's brilliant and ready to go. That is rare. More often than not, the editor has the idea first and goes out to try to sell the idea to an appropriate author, and they both have to work on some ways to make it happen. Sometimes the author submits a project, and it's half-baked, half-good. It's got some strengths. It takes a very discerning editor and a persuasive editor, an enthusiastic editor, to work with that author to elicit from it a manuscript that we think really can find a broader audience, which is both effective in substance and effective in style. And so the editor has to work with the author on both voice as well as content. So that sometimes that process takes 3, 4, 5 years. Sometimes it takes 6 weeks. Sometimes it can't happen. So there is no single formula, and editors who are forever balancing 25 books that are coming out this year that they acquired in the past, as well as acquiring new books and working on books. It's just a balancing act of impossible proportions that the very best people pull off in ways that I don't even know how they do it.
Well, we've talked with our guests, central to our program, and I think with your press, how do you enter into the public discourse? And it seems like some scholars are still getting used to that whole idea of being an intellectual in the public discourse. But central to what you're saying is that that's what needs to happen.
It certainly is. For example, we put out a very important book on gun control last year by David Hemingway, who's at Harvard, the Harvard School. We got a major grant from the Joyce Foundation to promote the book. Our publicist here arranged with the author, arranged for speaking tour in several colleges and press events, so that the author could speak not just to the book, but to the issue. And just a month ago, the Times ran a whole op-ed piece on this book because the issue had been so explosive. So that sometimes you hit it well and lucky, you have the right author, the right critics, the right environment, and the book gets attention. If it doesn't get reviews, if the author doesn't get appearances, if we can't link the book to the issue and to the author, then we don't sell anywhere near what we need to and should.
I think it's so crucial that academic presses thrive. Not only survive, but thrive.
I agree.
Because there's such a flow of media
Right.
content now. There's audio-visual, there's
Right.
movies,
Right.
there's the
Right.
internet, all that.
Right.
But we really need content. They talk about 500 channels on the cable systems, but a lot of it's repetition, a lot of it's syndicated, you know.
I mean, I think the ratio now of noise to signal or garbage to content is increasing. I think one only has to go to the internet now or to the blogs and see how much nonsense, how much sheer refuse occupies those sites. The university presses have not just a history of quality, but an obligation for quality, and they're supervised in terms of quality. I'm not sure that there's any other venue, any other media source that I find reliable in terms of the presentation of issues, which is why the loss of or the decline of university presses would be for me a national catastrophe that is almost unacknowledged. The university presses, unfortunately, because they so long have been insulated, encapsulated in a scholarly environment, have done, I think, a terrible job of selling themselves. Their existence was taken for granted. They were part of a university service. Now that they really have to sell not just individual books, but their very being and what their contribution could be, both to the intellectual community, but also to the political, cultural community. That sale of the university presses has not been made, and the university presses bear some of the responsibility for that.
But some of the university presses are not surviving. I mean, they're going under.
Oh, indeed.
Two
Two presses were closed last year.
Yeah.
Any number of presses I know are in very financially precarious positions, being buttressed at the moment by the somewhat reluctant support of their universities, who themselves are hard-pressed for cash, at the same time that universities are suffering, as Michigan is, major legislative cutbacks or endowment declines, are facing shortfalls in all sorts of directions, is just the time when the presses really require more rather than less support. And so now there's a crunch, and many presses are feeling that directly or indirectly. No press that I know of is escaping that, is not trying to deal with those consequences. Two presses have closed. More I think will follow, and it's important that I think people are aware of this issue and understand that it's not just a question of economics. That is, the loss of these presses will have a dramatic impact on the quality of the culture and the quality of political discourse, on intellectual dialogue, on the civic culture that has not been, partly because the presses, as I say, haven't sold themselves well enough. People are unaware of what the presses contribute to these dialogues. And it's a fault of the presses, it's a fault of other groups, but I think it's important, and that's why I'm delighted to be on the show, to make this case as powerfully and as extensively as possible, because we will all suffer. It's not just we at the press that would suffer were it to be diminished, but I believe that universities would suffer, regional cultures would suffer, and national dialogue would suffer.
Well, I've always looked at the university presses as satisfying the logos part of rhetoric. But there's another thing that in the national discourse is the ethos, the ethical dimension, and that's what we so desperately need. We need someone like scholars in the university presses who can bring a solid, informed position, not just to rip and tear off the latest report from CNN, but someone that takes an issue, carefully looks at it, and has accountability for what they're saying.
And stays with it. It stays with it. Doesn't publish it because there's somebody who's just been fired or came back from Iraq and has some revelation. Who's going to be there year in, year out, persisting in the analysis of an issue? I see no source of that other than university presses.
Absolutely.
And there's some magazines on the fringe that might, but they have small partisan audiences often. But the university presses are in the unparalleled position to really inform intelligent audiences about what's at stake in key issues.
Also, what you're talking about has some implications for scholars who want to get their material published.
Right.
And more than just the traditional exercise of getting the dissertation in print. What kinds of things should authors, anyone, remember in preparing their material for publication?
Well, what we tell the young scholars, and it's a bit of a stress, is that the book, the work that got you a thesis, the work that got you a PhD, which used to be almost automatically published by university presses and became your tenure book, that publication is no longer automatic. To the extent that it's possible to broaden your audience, to bring in broader issues sometimes than a thesis incorporates, to speak to audiences that are different from your advisors and your committee, to include other examples, to maybe eliminate some of the scholarly apparatus and make it more accessible to an intelligent audience, dramatically increases the probability of a publication. which is not to say the straight monograph, the academic book, the scholarly book with scholarly apparatus written for scholars no longer can be published. But that is now being much more selective. So you widen the possible audiences and the probability of publication, the more kinds of audiences can find this interesting and accessible.
So there needs to be a dialogue between the press and the scholar.
Oh, absolutely.
How can this topic make the connections with other scholars and other readers?
And people from this press spend a lot of time speaking both to local departments and to junior faculty, but not just junior faculty, about what they might do to make their book more appealing or more likely to be attractive to a publisher. We talk at the Organization of American Historians. I'm leading a panel this year on how to get published, or the state of publishing. So this is a concern for everybody, but there's an opportunity for re-education. You know, in this crisis, you know, something constructive can emerge.
Well, there's potential in the moment
That's
for
right.
something that would be even more exciting.
That's right.
And
because you've got there are almost 100 presses, 100 members of the American Association of University Presses. Probably 90 universities have presses, and by their very nature, they're dispersed all over the country. They cover the landscape in a way that trade publishing, big commercial publishers, are all focused in New York. So the country is blanketed by academic presses at the moment, at least, and they are in that just gives them an opportunity. They follow the land grants, they follow the state patterns, but that means that there is this national network of presses poised to produce important critical literature that would otherwise not find any public appearance.
well, there's a big investment to producing a book. I don't have to tell you that. And what's the sense of producing something that will, in fact, be read by very few, or could have the potential of affecting a great number of people?
Right. I mean, sometimes a very small run of a book can have enormous influence, a disproportionate influence. So small numbers doesn't always imply small impact. But it is true that if we can get more people to read our books and really expand the dialogue, expand the universe of intellectual participation, I think we've done a great service. And that is something that I think university presses can aspire to. Didn't in the past, are now.
Well, as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, this is the year of the university press, and we've talked a bit about how to survive in the new market. One of the big things, too, is the challenge of electronic digital technology, including how you produce the book, what the implications are as far as marketing, and how it's available and distributed.
Yeah. We are fascinated and much involved with considerations of digital publishing, because sooner or later, a lot of the publishing will migrate from a print environment to a digital environment. A lot of the claims that this would have happened 10, 15 years ago were obviously premature. And almost all of the attempts to affect a digital publishing transformation have at the moment, if not failed, at least been put on hold. I believe that that will change in the near future, that we are involved in all sorts of plans or potential digital projects. The year of the university press was announced by the libraries. Came out of the Library Association. And we have been in very close collaboration with the library here at Michigan, which may be the country's leader in academic digital publishing. They have an enormous digital segment and section. We have several projects mounted with them jointly. We're talking about putting on as a trial several of our books as for almost open access in the near future to see how that affects sales. We have to be very careful about damaging or jeopardizing our revenues. There's some evidence that having at least part of a book available digitally doesn't compete with sales. There's a big project at Chicago, which we're a part of, which aspires, called the BiblioVault, which with the aid of a $3 million grant, two $1.5 million grants from the Mellon Foundation, is hoping to mount eventually virtually all university press books digitally, which can then be sold in various packages to libraries and or individuals. And that would be a way for the university presses to take control of their digital project and not to turn them over to the external aggregators who tend to use university projects in ways that at least partially violate our intentions and principles.
Then there's that whole issue of intellectual property and copyright. So I
That's
don't
right.
have to, but that is a very serious issue for
It's a
the
major
scholars
issue.
and for the press.
It's a major issue, partly because although we always have secured rights for all digital or all print versions of books, we have not been all that good in the past at making sure we had rights to the digital, first the digital presentation of books, but also to reproduce digitally material in the books that isn't ours, but for which we got print rights, illustrations, poems, songs, words. So that the issue of permissions, particularly in the digital environment, is a very complicated one, and now we're backtracking. It's easy enough to protect those rights in the future. It's hard to sort of reobtain them for, we have 2,000 books in print, of which maybe 5 have all the digital permissions cleared. So this is a major headache.
And it takes some more staff time in order to
That's right.
have someone follow through on that.
Staff which is already working far too hard.
Yeah. We can't finish this interview without having you talk about some of your latest projects here that we have on the shelf. So,
well, a few that I brought over I brought only to illustrate the new range of books. Even when we do academic books now, we're doing extremely well this season with this remarkable book on the Crusades, which is gorgeous and can be and has been used as a gift book, but has simply an array of the best Crusade scholars writing crusade after crusade. So this, I would say, is an important example of a book which combines academic strength. I mean, there is nothing shabby about the scholarship in this. In fact, it's front line. But at the same time, producing a book that lots of people, non-scholars, particularly in this environment, when we're in the midst of what's been termed a modern crusade, want to see some background and context.
I guess the question is, do you think that the University of Michigan Press will survive the changes that will be coming?
I do. I think that it will survive and thrive. I think both because the internal support from the university, from the top, from the administrative level, down to individual faculty and departments, has been unstinting. I mean, it has really been gratifying. The support under very difficult circumstances. The university's patience has been tried by the finances, but the general support has been without qualification. And everybody has wished the press well and provided whatever resources were possible. That, in terms of the new publishing agenda and the new efforts and enterprise on the part of press members, I believe will lead to, despite the very difficult publishing environment, will lead to a successful outcome.
Well, I'm glad to hear that,
Yeah.
because I'd love to see it
Yeah.
continue as grand tradition. Thank you for being on Rip Rap.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.